One of the cruelest ironies associated with Jimmy Carter was that evangelicals turned against him and became a conservative political force during his presidency.
Right. Welcome to this special edition of Good Faith Weekly. President James Earl Carter Jr. died on December 29th, 2024. The 39th President of the United States was a beacon of light for many, standing unassumingly tall for principles we should all cherish. There is one word that keeps being repeated to describe Carter. That word is character. More than many presidents, Carter allowed his principles to guide his presidency and life. The love of his lifetime, Rosalind, preceded him in death. The two kids from Plains, Georgia, taught the world about the importance of community, the significance of purpose, and the meaning of generosity. While Carter developed noteworthy accomplishments in office, his light truly shone outside his presidency. A man of faith, Carter deeply admired the inclusivity of the Gospels and prophetic justice. He let God's love, grace, and justice permeate his life through impactful actions, whether eradicating guinea worms through the Carter Center or working on construction for Habitat for Humanity. Jimmy and Rosalind were the epitome of preaching the gospel without words. When Good Faith Media learned about President Carter's death, we turned to one of the country's premier religious historians to discuss the former president's life and legacy. Missy and I have the privilege of sharing our conversation with Dr. Randall Balmer of Dartmouth College as he reflects on and remembers our 39th president, Jimmy Carter. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a very special guest with us. After last week's news breaking that former President Jimmy Carter passed away at the age of 100, we sought one of the best historians about American religion in the United States to talk about the life and legacy of really one of the greatest men that ever lived, President Jimmy Carter. And so we have invited prize-winning historian and Emmy Award-winning nominee Randall Balmer back to the show. Randall is a professor of religion at Dartmouth College. He's widely published in scholarly journals and the popular press, and he has written an extensive biography about President Carter titled Redeemer, The Life of Jimmy Carter. Randall, unfortunate circumstances, but we always appreciate you coming on the show. And we thought to ourselves, there's no better person to reflect upon the life and legacy of President Jimmy Carter than you. So thanks for coming to Good Faith Weekly.
Always a pleasure, Mitch and Missy, too.
So, Randall, just before we get started with our conversation, I just wanted to ask, when you heard last week that President Carter had passed, what was your initial reaction?
Well, I was sad, certainly, but it's certainly not unexpected.
Right, sure, yeah.
100 years old. As I think you know, I'm under contract with CNN to provide commentary when he died.
Mm-hmm.
And so when he went into hospice almost now 2 years ago, I had my phone on the nightstand, ready to go, ready to jump out of bed. And turns out almost 2 years later, it finally happened. But it's a passing of an era. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
American politics is not the same without him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's also fair to say that American evangelicalism is not the same without Jimmy Carter. And I expect we'll probably talk about that in this conversation.
Yeah. And we're going to talk a lot about the biography that you wrote 10 years ago now, and then also the life and legacy of President Carter. But just hearing you talk, Randall, when I heard the news last week that President Carter had passed, I mean, like you said, we have been anticipating this moment for several years now. But when that news actually broke, I found myself kind of going back to the 1970s when he ran for president and when he was elected, and really kind of took me back to that time period. I was kind of really surprised by how visceral that reaction was upon hearing that news. So I had a lot of reflection going on about my own life, thinking about President Carter's presidency as well as his life afterwards. But you wrote an incredible biography back in 2014 about President Carter. We mentioned it earlier in the introduction, called Redeemer. So What prompted you a decade ago to write about President Jimmy Carter?
Well, actually, I've been thinking about it for a very long time. I was a college student when Jimmy Carter burst onto the national scene, and I was a student at Trinity College, Deerfield, Illinois, an evangelical school, as you know. Sadly, it closed a couple of years ago now. And I remember just being so almost dumbfounded that here we had a national political figure who talked openly about being a born again Christian and an evangelical. And, that's certainly how we referred to ourselves and how I referred to myself. But we were always kind of sheepish about it. And he wasn't. he
Right, right,
was
right, right.
he was very forthright and said, "This is who I am," and in effect, deal with it. And I like to say that the moment that Mr. Carter declared he was an evangelical Christian, he sent every journalist in New York to his Rolodex to figure out what in the world he was talking about.
Right, right, right.
And now, of course, it's part of the um, vocabulary
Sure.
for all Americans.
Right.
For better or worse, right?
Yes,
That's
we'll get to
exactly.
that.
Absolutely. Well, like I said, you did a lot of research 10 years ago and then also have followed his life and have done even more research since then, preparing for this moment in our history. But as you were doing your research and you become a student of President Carter, not only of his presidency, but as the influence he had upon the faith community at large, what was the most interesting fact that you learned in your research about President Carter?
I think probably what strikes me most is his consistency. That is to say, he lived out his beliefs, I think, to a remarkable degree. And as a person of faith, I'm sort of jealous of that. I wish that I had such a consistent, uh, what we used to call witness.
Mhm.
Um, he was utterly consistent. Now, he had his faults. There's no question about that. He would have been the first to admit that. And politically, I think we have to also talk about the 1970 campaign for governor of Georgia, when toward the end of that campaign, he did appeal to the white segregationist vote. And I think this a low point in his political career,
Right.
one that he was aware of. But it's also fair to point out that in his inauguration address as governor of Georgia on January 12th, 1971, he also declared that the time for racial segregation was over.
Mhm.
And so he pivoted. I think this 1970 campaign would have to be regarded as a kind of an ends justifies the means campaign if he were to try to
Sure.
rationalize it himself. And of course, he used that platform as governor of Georgia and then later as president of the United States, and even later as a former president to do a number of good things. But had he not won that second campaign for governor
Mhm.
in 1970, arguably he wouldn't have had those platforms.
That's right. Well, he is one of the most compelling figures that we have seen in politics for some time. A lot of that is because of his longevity and living, but also just how important his faith was to him, not only personally, but also it came across in his public policy as well. So,
Yes.
my question is what did the American people not understand about President Carter that now, after his death, really needs to be fleshed out even more?
It's a great question. I think what at the during his presidency, what they failed to appreciate was that he was playing the long game. That is to say, he was willing to take political positions that were unpopular because he wanted to have a better end result. I'll give you a couple examples of that. One of the first things he does, aside from pardoning Vietnam era draft resistors, which was his first official act as president. But one of the first things he did was to renegotiate the Panama Canal treaties.
Mhm.
Now, that has been in the works since the Johnson administration in the 1960s. But Mr. Carter recognized that if the United States was to have any meaningful relationship with third world countries, particularly Latin American countries, we had to move away from our colonialism and our colonialist foreign policy. And so he believed that was the right thing to do. Now, his advisors were upset with him
Mhm.
because they said, no, wait, do other things. Do this in your second term. And one of the loudest voices on that particular issue was Rosalind, his wife, saying, no, do that in your second term when you have political capital to spend.
Right.
Well, instead, he spent a great deal of political capital on renegotiating the Panama Canal treaties. And that arguably crippled him politically for the remainder of his term. So that would be one example.
Yeah.
The other example would be economics. Uh, and you folks don't look old enough to remember the 70s. So.
One of us isn't.
Yeah, I do, Randall. I do.
But those who do remember, let's put it this way: those of us who do remember the 70s, it was a time. It was not a happy time in many ways. It was you had the Arab oil embargoes, you had the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Interest rates were going through the roof, and one of the decisions that Mr. Carter faced as president was who is going to be the head of the Federal Reserve, and a lot of presidents have treated that as a political decision, a political calculus.
Mm-hmm.
And he decided that if the economy was to have long-term health, we needed somebody who was going to be really strict on interest rates. So he appointed Paul Volcker, who was an inflation hawk, as head of the Federal Reserve. Volcker raised interest rates, sky high, and I remember this very clearly. And everybody felt the pinch, but the payoff occurred in the 1980s,
right?
Sadly for Carter, when Reagan was president. But it was a long-term decision that he took. His advisors said, and many of them have said this, that if you were trying to make a case for a particular policy decision to President Carter, the worst thing you could do would be to argue that it was good for him politically.
Right.
He just refused to allow that to enter into the calculus. And of course, that hurt him politically, and he lost in 1980.
Yeah.
So I want to go back, something you guys obviously have already alluded to. Mitch, you very much remember that stage of the 70s.
Oh, yeah.
I was born but too young to really remember. And so my memories as he passed kind of were like yours. Like I went back to what I could recall. And what I could recall was all of the talk really post-presidency when Reagan was elected about, the gas lines, which all I keep saying is the eggs. Price of eggs we're getting so upset about now, and how that will flesh out in history. But anyways, I digress. But one of the mysteries to me growing up in the Christian South as an evangelical, as a Southern Baptist, was that President Carter was so progressive in his theology, and it didn't really compute in my young mind of how that happened. He supported women in ministry, creation care, racial justice, the Palestinian people, the affirmation of LGBTQ folks. So my question to you is, knowing him as well as you do, or studying him, is like, how did that happen? Because you didn't see that coming out of areas like we grew up.
No, absolutely. And that's the difference, I would argue, between the 1970s and the 1980s in American evangelicalism. Just to go back, and I don't want to get into the weeds here, but what happens in the 1970s in terms of evangelicalism is very interesting. First of all, for most evangelicals, particularly in the North, they were not organized politically in the middle decades of the 20th century. It's a little bit different for Southern Baptists. The Southern Baptist Church is really the established religion of the South, of course. But for those of us who grew up in the North, we were very much marginalized in politics, culture, society, everything, and we felt it very acutely. So we were not involved in politics, many not even registered to vote. And what happens is that in 1973, there was a remarkable gathering of 55 evangelical theologians and leaders in Chicago at the Wabash Hotel on Wabash Street. And they hammer out a document called the Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern. And I invite your listeners to take a look at it. You can call it up on the web. Make sure you look for the 1973 version. And what's remarkable about that document is that it states policy positions that I would argue are derived from the New Testament, but more recently from the example of 19th century evangelical activists. So, for example, in the 19th centuries, evangelicals were very active in various social reform movements, generally tilted toward those on the margins of society, those Jesus would call the least of these.
Mhm.
So they were active in prison reform. They were active in forming common schools, or what we would call public schools today, or public education, because they recognized that was the way to lift the fortunes of those on the lower rungs of society. They organized peace crusades. And they also affirmed the equality of women, including voting rights for women, which in the 19th century was considered a rather radical idea.
Mhm.
So this Chicago Declaration restates a lot of those principles that had been characteristic of 19th century evangelicals. And when one of my final conversations with Mr. Carter, I asked him if he knew about it at the time. He said he didn't. He didn't know about the Chicago Declaration at that time, but that as he came to know it, he was very comfortable with the positions that were staked out in that declaration. And I would argue that Carter's election in 1976 was kind of the high point of this resurgence of what I would call progressive evangelicalism. And by the way, I asked him if he was comfortable with that term to apply to himself, and he said yes, he was.
Mhm.
Even though, as we all know, Southern Baptists regard evangelical as a Yankee term,
Right, right.
uh, he was happy to be identified as a progressive evangelical. So, what happens, to get to your question, what happens to what you're seeing in the 1980s is that there had been a radical right turn politically on behalf of many evangelicals. And that's typically attributed to the Roe v. Wade ruling. And I know we've had this conversation before, and I don't want to rehearse everything here, but that is absolutely false. It had
Right.
nothing to do with abortion. Abortion was a Catholic issue throughout the 1970s. And the real issue that got evangelicals mobilized politically was the defense of racial segregation. There's no pretty way to say this. The defense of racial segregation at places like Bob Jones University and so-called segregation academies, like Jerry Falwell's
Right.
Lynchburg Christian Academy in Virginia, which had been formed in 1967 to avoid the integration or the desegregation of public schools. So um, and the turning point, I think, really is the 1980 presidential election,
Mhm.
when evangelicals turned dramatically against Carter. One of their own, so,
Mhm.
I mean, you can't get any
Right.
more
Yeah.
evangelical than a Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher. And they embrace instead Ronald Reagan and hitched their wagon to the Republican Party beginning in 1980. That's the real turning point.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I started coming into awareness, at least of the, maybe not politics, but the vibe in my home or in my church or in my community was right about that time Reagan took the presidency.
Yeah, it's interesting that and I'm so glad that you brought that up, Randall, because we recently had an episode dedicated to the passing of Tony Campolo here
Sure.
recently, and Tony used to refer to himself as an evangelical, and so especially when younger generations hear that term of some of our forefathers who are now and foremothers who are going on and transitioning into the next life, those terms to describe them kind of takes them aback, especially when evangelicalism, is used in that way. So I appreciate you explaining it that way.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's really sad. I mean, I think one of the cruelest ironies associated with Jimmy Carter was that evangelicals turned against him and became a conservative political force during his presidency.
Right.
And that's just, yeah, it's very sad to
Yeah.
me. And it was to him too.
Yeah. We can talk a lot about President Carter's presidency. I know there's going to be a lot of conversation over the next week or so about his presidency, but in your biography, you talk a lot about not only his pre-presidency, but also his post-presidency and the influences that were made upon him and the influences he made upon the world at large. And so the first question I have is that you talk a lot about his relationship with his beloved partner in life, Rosalind, and they knew each other basically from crib there in Plains. So what kind of influence did Rosalind have on President Carter throughout his entire life?
I think the influence was profound. There's no question about that. Actually, I left my conversations with them, and I spent time with both of them. I mean, not a whole lot of time, but some time with them. Uh, when I left Plains, I remember that day thinking that the only person that Jimmy Carter fully trusted was Rosalind.
Mhm.
And of course, they were married for 77 years, and she was an advisor to him, both politically and in terms of policy while he was in the White House. And but it was not a kind of uh, meek, subordinate relationship on
Right.
her part by any stretch of the imagination. Again, in one of our conversations, I talked about how the day he decided to go into politics, he woke up. You probably know the story, but he woke up on his 28th birthday, which was October 1st, 1962, and instead of getting dressed in his work clothes, he wore his essentially his Sunday clothes to go down to the courthouse to file to run for the Georgia State Senate. And and Roseland said, what's going on? What are you doing? He said, I'm going to run for the Georgia State Senate. And he told me he actually blushed. He said, I can't believe I did that. I can't believe I did that without consulting the first.
Uh,
And he would never imagine doing that
sure.
later in his life.
Yeah.
The other story that shows Roseland's resolve occurred in 1953. Uh, Jimmy Carter's father, Mr. Earl, as he was known in town, was dying. And so Jimmy Carter was stationed at that time in Schenectady, New York. And he was given a leave to go down and stand by his father's bedside. And what impressed him was the number of people from the community who came to the hospital to pay their regards and to thank Mr. Earl for all of the acts of kindness that he had done. So um, he had paid the mortgage for
Mm.
various people who were in financial um, circumstances where they couldn't. He extended credit from the Carter store to those who couldn't afford what they needed. And in one case, he bought new clothes for a family so they could attend their daughter's graduation and feel proud
Yeah.
to be there. And that profoundly affected Jimmy Carter. And he decided, on the basis of witnessing that he was going to resign his commission in the Navy and return to Plains and try to have the kind of influence on the community that his father had.
Mhm.
Well, so he goes back to Schenectady and he informs Rosalind that they're moving back to Plains. And she was not amused. She enjoyed being a Navy wife. She liked traveling the world. And apparently, the long car ride from Schenectady, New York to Southwest Georgia transpired in almost total silence between these two very strong willed individuals.
I was gonna say I would have loved to have been the fly on the wall
Yeah.
in that car, but actually, I don't even think I would
Yeah.
have wanted to be
Nothing.
part of
Nothing was said.
that. No, can you
Imagine
even imagine?
cut the tension with a knife.
That's right. Well, Randall, I've got two more questions for you before I hand it off to Missy, and both are the same question but different concentrations. The first one is this: when we lay President Carter to rest this week, and the country mourns his passing, but also celebrates the man who he was and still is to this day. What will be the legacy that the country holds on to of Jimmy Carter, the president?
Well, I think first of all, there are more accomplishments than he's given credit for. And one of
Mhm.
the things that's happening, and this is, why I love being a historian in some ways, is that historians tend every few years to kind of circle back and say, let's take another look. And this is happening now with Mr. Carter. I think my biography was part of that. I'm not claiming that I changed the conversation, but
Mhm.
I wanted to take another look at Mr. Carter and to assess him and to give due regard to his faith because I think his faith was important to him, and so I wanted to treat it seriously as he did. So uh, again, there's a fuller understanding of some of the things that he did, and the list is really remarkable.
Yeah.
Conservationists, for example,
Mhm.
consider him the best environmental president we've ever had,
Mhm.
and that all of that, his um, his policies, his demeanor, I think issued out of his faith and his sense of being a follower of Jesus and how to act on that in the world. So I think that would be the first thing, that there's a greater appreciation for what he accomplished as president. But also, I think he was important for restoring integrity to the White House. And again, the historical context is awfully important.
Absolutely.
Lyndon Johnson had lied to us about Vietnam. Richard Nixon lied to us about pretty much everything. Carter comes along and he says, I'm not going to lie to you.
Yeah.
And what I find remarkable is that no one has credibly claimed that he reneged on that promise.
Right.
And that's, I think, very, very remarkable.
Absolutely.
Particularly given the current state of the presidency, I think that's a remarkable statement.
Well, that's a great way to explain the legacy of Mr. Carter as president. But many of us who lived through the 70s more so know about his work post-presidency. So what legacy will President Carter leave behind as Jimmy Carter, the man?
I think his post-presidency really showed who he was and really showed his character. That is to say that it's typical for ex-presidents to kind of cash in
Right.
on their celebrity, their notoriety, their connections, and so forth. Serving on culprit boards and pulling in huge lecture fees and so forth. And Mr. Carter refused to do that. The Carter Center, he decided, would be an activist organization rather than merely a celebratory one. And he made good on that. He was an ambassador for peace around the world, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. He also monitored democratic elections all around the world. And perhaps his greatest accomplishment was maybe a Habitat for Humanity goes in there as well. But the Carter Center set its sights on eliminating several tropical diseases. And in 1986, when they started this, there were 3.5 million cases of guinea worm disease in the world, which is a very painful and debilitating illness. And last year, 2024, the number had been reduced to 7. And it's on its way to extinction, just as polio is, for all intents and purposes, or smallpox extinct. And that is due to Jimmy Carter, and he was acting out his faith. Now, he did tell me in one of our conversations, he said, had he been reelected in 1980, it's very likely he would not have done a lot of the things he did as a former president.
Right.
And a lot of historians are referred to his post-presidency as his second term. And I think that probably is true. My favorite quote about Jimmy Carter comes from James Laney, who was the former president of Emory University and who helped Carter establish the Carter Center and the library and so forth. And James Laney said that Jimmy Carter was the only person in history for whom the presidency was a stepping stone.
Oh, I
think that captures it pretty well.
Absolutely.
I love that description.
Well, Randall Balmer, thank you so much for joining us on Good Faith Weekly. Randall's book about President Carter is titled Redeemer, The Life of Jimmy Carter. He wrote it 10 years ago, but President Carter was 90 years old back then. So it covers the majority of the president's life. So it is a wonderful biography. Dr. Balmer, it's always a joy to talk to you. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and collection of memories about President Carter. But before we let you go, we've got one last question that we have always asked you, and I turn it over to Missy to let her do it.
So, Randall, as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So, in light of your work and our conversation today, what is your more to tell?
I think the last time we had a conversation, I said that history mattered, and I probably stick to that, but let me modify it a little bit in light of our conversation. And I would say that what's more to the story is that character matters. I think Jimmy Carter exemplifies the importance of character.
I love that.
It's a great way to end this interview. Dr. Balmer, thank you again for joining us, and blessings upon you and yours as this new year begins.
And you as well. Thank you.
You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.